So then why are leveraged ETFs bad investments, or why are they not good investments to hold in most cases if they check both of the boxes of investing? Well, let's talk about that. So as we've talked about, if you buy an ETF that tracks a certain index and that index were to drop, and let's say it were a 2-to-1 index, then what you'll see is twice the drop of the index will be the drop of the levered ETF. And so what you see is if it drops 1%, then the leveraged ETF will drop 2. And so let's just say we talk about one of the worst days. So back in the 80s, I think the S&P 500 dropped something like, it was over 20% in a day. I think it was like 22 point something, but it was over 20% in a day. So let's just say worst case scenario, right? Well, let's say the index drops by 20%. Well, if an index drops 20%, it takes 25% gain to get back to where you were before it dropped by 20%, right? So if you had, $100, it dropped to 80, you have to make 25% of 80 to get back to 100. 25% of 80 is 20, so 80 plus 20 gets you back to the 100, right? Easy math. Okay, but that changes with the leveraged ETF. So if at the same time that the index dropped 20%, let's say the leveraged ETF is, once again, it's 2-to-1, well, it would drop 40%. And if it drops 40%, you would have to increase by 2/3, 66.67%, to get back to where you started. So you see the issue here. The issue falls in this place where if the market did fall like that, or any kind of losses, that's just an example to show you how magnified it can be. But let's say with these types of losses, it only takes 25% for the index to get back, but it takes 66.6666% to get back for the leverage ETF. And you may say, well, aren't the gains multiplied too? Yes, the gains are multiplied. But like I said, you need 25% to get back on the regular index. Well, so that means, okay, if the regular index goes up 25%, then the leveraged ETF went up 50%, exactly, right? So 2-to-1, it goes up 50%. Well, that's not 66.67%. And so you can see how losses can eat into your long-term gains more than you would like, because it's going to take more, even more of the index going up in order to get you back to just where you started with those leveraged ETFs. And another thing that we look at with leveraged ETFs, and the reason why I say they may not be a good idea for most people, is that they do have higher fees than normal index investing and normal ETFs. Why is that? Well, they're going to have fees associated with having to purchase the premiums on the options and having to put up margin on the things that they borrow. So they need that money from somewhere. So where are they going to take it? From investors. And then the expense ratios on a lot of leveraged ETFs are over 1%. But with most traditional ETFs and market indexes, you can get for basically zero, for basically free. If not, I know Vanguard's got some for 0.04%, and I know Fidelity has the free S&P 500 index, a zero expense ratio. So all of those things play into your returns. So even if the returns do knock it out of the park on the upward slope, then you're still going to get hit with fees that you wouldn't get hit with indexes as well. Now, despite these fees, these leveraged ETFs are a more efficient way of doing margin, is what it's called, margin. So purchasing with leverage in an index. It is a cheaper way than trying to do it the traditional margin route. And so it can be efficient for individuals who do margin trading, but that's really, really speculative. That's not what we're looking at. That's really not the type of investing that we're talking about here. And what's the biggest problem that I have with leveraged ETFs? Well, the biggest problem is that they are not long-term investments. We're long-term investors. We want to be long-term investors. We are playing the long game with our investing. We're not playing the short term. If we were playing the short term, we'd be speculating on everything, but that's not what we're doing. We're trying to invest for the long term. And leverage ETFs just aren't that good for that. Leverage ETFs are typically used by traders who want to take advantage of the momentum of an index in the short term, because they see the same thing that you see and that I just told you, that the downward returns are harder to come back from. So they just want to take advantage of the upward momentum. That's really, really hard to do. It's almost impossible. It is impossible to do perfectly. So it's just, these are not being used for long-term investing. And so the fluctuation in them, the volatility in them is going to be crazy, especially in the short term when things are getting really wild, maybe to the downside. And so that means that leveraged ETFs really suck for us, because what are we trying to do? We're trying to go slow and steady wins the race. We're trying to systematically invest for the long term. And leveraged ETFs just aren't allowing us to do that in an efficient way, even though they are investments, even though they can have safety of principal, even though they can have satisfactory returns. They're just not what investors need to be putting their money in to get long-term gains and to do the best that they can long-term, net of fees and net of any costs of an index or a fund.